Luckily, or maybe unfortunately, I am only responsible for the Dutch and Flemish prints and drawings in our collection. And these includes works from the 15th century until the end of the 19th century. So when I say Dutch and Flemish, this might be a bit misleading geographically speaking, because it's not just Dutch or Flemish drawings. In fact, if you look at this map, you see that my Dutch and Flemish school comprise the Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and even the north of France. So in my day-to-day job, it is my responsibility to look after all these masterpieces. And in between, of course, I have to try to organize exhibitions. So that's what I've been busy doing in the last few months. Years. So in the last few years, me and 5 other curators have been busy working on this exhibition, and it's an exhibition on Metalpoint drawings, which is not a very well-known drawing technique, but which I will explain to you later. So here you see a selection of drawings. The exhibition will open in May in Washington, in the United States, and then it will travel to London, to the British Museum in September. And so it will open on the 10th of September and close on the 6th of December, so please book your flights and come and visit us. So the Metalpoint technique then, it's a very complicated technique, and I'll try to explain it to you by using modern photographs of modern artists trying to replicate the technique. So the metal technique is very specific. It's never been explored before in an exhibition, so this will be the first time that you'll be able to see almost 100 sheets made in this technique, because all the drawings are very precious, they're very delicate. It's very difficult to borrow them from other museums. They're usually the highlights, the masterpieces of any graphic collection, so it's difficult to get a good group together. Nevertheless, we managed to collect 100 sheets, of which the majority will come from the British Museum collection, which will then complement with loans from museums in Europe and the United States. The drawings will date from the late 14th century until now, because there are still contemporary artists working in this technique. And the drawings will come from Italy, Germany, Belgium, Holland, Britain, and also America. In this talk, I will focus on the Dutch and Flemish section, so all the drawings made in the Low Countries, as I've shown before, from the late 14th century until the end of the 17th century. So Metalpoint technique is a bit more complicated than other drawing techniques, so it's not like, for example, chalk or pen and ink or graphite that you can simply draw on a sheet of paper or on basically any surface you want. With Metalpoint, you first need to prepare the support. And the support can be a thin wooden tablet, it can be a sheet of paper, or it can be a piece of vellum or parchment. So what you see here is someone brushing the mixture onto a piece of paper. And the mixture, which is called the ground or the preparation, exists of a mixture of bone ash, and bone ash are burnt animal bones, which are ground into a powder, and these are then mixed with chalk and with animal glue. So once you've made the paste, or sometimes it can be more liquidy, it depends, sometimes it's very thick and pasty, sometimes it's very watery and thick. Once you've obtained that, you need to apply layers onto the support. So as you see here, then if there's some inclusions, if there's some rough particles still from the burnt animal bones, you might need to polish the surface so it's easier to draw upon the surface, and then you just need to wait until the paper is dry, and then you can start drawing upon it with a Metalpoint. The ground can be made in different colors, because you can just add pigments to the ground when you're mixing it. And you'll see in the slides that the Dutch and Flemish examples are all quite modest. They're all very pale, usually using cream color, white color. And this is in great contrast to, for example, Italian metal point drawings, because the Italians, they just add pink, blue, green, yellow, and they're all very bright, but you'll see the Dutch and Flemish are very different. So here you see a selection of metal styluses, and again, these are modern examples. So the metal stylus can be made of silver, gold, or copper, and there is no need for it to be lead or graphite, the two bottom ones you see, because as said before, these can just be drawn upon on unprepared surfaces as well. Also, we use the term metal point when we're not quite sure which metal has been used. So in order to know for sure which metal the draftsman has used while drawing, it's necessary to scientifically analyze the particles, the metal particles. And as long, not many sheets have been analyzed so far, we've tried to do it for most of the British Museum ones now. So if we're not sure, instead of calling them silver point drawings or gold point drawings, we'll just call them metal point drawings. So how it works then. So once we have our prepared surface, which is a bit rough, it's actually an abrasive surface because of the ground animal bones, you can start drawing on it with one of these metal styluses. And what happens then is that tiny particles of the metal, only visible on a microscopical level, will then be left on the surface. And so then when you trace the stylus over the sheet of paper, a line will appear. So the line is basically just tiny, tiny metal particles on the sheet of paper. Here you see some older examples, and this one is really a luxury item, and it's decorated with stones and it's interweaved with gold and silver. But it doesn't have to be like that. It can also just be a solid silver rod, it can be a solid brass rod even, and then the artist can just tip the ends into a bit of liquid gold or liquid silver, so you only have the end that is coated in the metal. If you want an even cheaper tool, you can just use a small point or even a tiny wire and stick it in a wooden or a bone handle, as you see here on the right. In fact, you can use any metal objects that are available, so it's known that some artists have made drawings with silver coins or even with silver knives or gold forks. So as long as you have a solid metal, you can use it to make metal point drawings. Also, the width of the lines depends on the metal point, so you can have a very sharp point or you can have a blunter point, and that will affect the width of the line, so you can have broad lines or fine lines. What is special about silver point as well is that the lines will gradually become darker after the drawing has been made. So although they will always be visible to the artist when he's drawing, the moment they get exposed to oxygen, they will start to oxidize, so the silver will oxidize. And here you see a modern example. This is how it looks like when it's just been drawn, and after a few hours you can already see that the lines have become a lot darker. So, but I think this only happens for a few years, so now the metal point drawings we have are all stable and will not become any more darker. There is also a different range of colors in the metals, and this depends on, first of all, the metal alloys, so depending on which metal is used, but also on the environmental conditions. So if drawings have been exposed to more oxygen or less oxygen will be shown in the color of the lines. Here are some 19th century examples by Alphonse Le Gros, and on the left we see silver point, and this is made in gold point. And immediately you see the difference between the two, because silver point is a bit warmer, it turns a bit more brownish, purplish, orangey, brown. While gold point is actually very stable, and so it's very useful for an artist to know that his drawing will stay exactly the same as when he drew it. So here you see that the gold point has retained a very, I find it a cool grey color. Of course, gold point is much rarer, and that has everything to do with the cost of the actual metal gold. So that's why it's more common to find silver point drawings. So the advantage of silver point, because why would you go through so much hassle? Why would you spend so much money on having a silver pen or a gold pen? But as you can see, metal point is very useful for creating very precise lines. If you have a metal point with a very sharp point, then you can achieve the highest detail, you can create the finest lines. And that is something that was needed from the 15th century onwards, because you have to imagine that graphite, for example, which can be sharpened and which will have a fine point, didn't exist then. So graphite is only discovered and widely used from the mid-16th century. So if you want to make a drawing in chalk or in pen and ink, you just won't get the same finesse, you won't get the same delicate lines that you would get with metal point. Another advantage of the metal point technique is also that it's a dry technique. So there's no hassle with ink or water. You can just make very neat lines and you don't smudge. This of course has as advantage that metal point is used a lot in sketchbooks, because you won't smudge the other pages when you make a drawing. Unfortunately, not many of these sketchbooks have survived. This is a very rare example from the German school by Hans Belden Green, dated around 1522. And here you actually see a metal point, which I think is a brass pin, and the end has been dipped in silver. It is likely that a lot of the drawings that were originally in these sketchbooks were later taken out by later collectors, and so that's why nowadays most of the metal drawings come to us as loose sheets. So metal point is a very demanding and a very time-consuming activity, and so this makes it very useful for certain types of drawings. So it's very useful to make portrait studies because you can achieve the highest detail in all the facial features and the hair. It's also very useful for copying, for really meticulously copying smaller elements from larger compositions. It's of course not very useful to work out an entire composition because it would take you too much time. It's not very useful for example, Baroque artists. So Rubens never used the metal point technique because it's not for very spontaneous artists. You need to be very controlled, you need to be very attentive while you're doing it, or you'll break the ground and your whole drawing is lost. So because of this attention that is required while using the metal point technique, it's also often used as part of an artist's training. So when an artist was working with a master and in his workshop, usually he was copying the master's work as a way to train himself in the drawing technique. So the earliest examples of the metal point drawings in the Low Countries are actually wooden tablets. And I didn't find a very good picture of this, but this is actually a wooden tablet made of boxwood, which is prepared the same way as the sheets of paper. As you can see, these wooden tablets contain individual figures, individual studies, heads, busts, and so they're not entire compositions. So it's likely that these wooden panels, which also would have been bound into booklets originally, that these were probably kept in artists' workshops as a sort of model book. So the artist could copy an element that he would find interesting, keep it in his model book, and then he could refer to it afterwards when he was creating new compositions. So later on, artists will start to use more paper and vellum or parchment instead of these wooden tablets. Only very few of the metal point drawings that have survived, and then especially from the 15th century, are original studies by an artist, by a master. And the very few that have survived are preparatory studies for portrait paintings. Again, as I explained before, because you could really achieve the highest detail with the metal point to render the facial features of the sitter. And so here, this is perhaps the greatest example of a metal point drawing from the 15th century. And so this is by Jan van Eyck. which is in Dresden. And it is a study for the painting by the so-called Portrait of the Cardinal Niccolo Albergati, which is in Vienna. So if you look at the face, you can see all the details are rendered, so every wrinkle, every hair of the cardinal. And if you look even more careful, you can see that around the head there are inscriptions, and these are probably autograph inscriptions by Jan van Eyck, and the content of these inscriptions are color notes, and he really describes all the colors of his hair, of his cheek, of his eyes, and he goes into great length. So presumably Jan van Eyck made this portrait study of the cardinal, perhaps because the cardinal couldn't be there when Jan van Eyck was actually painting the portrait, and you have to imagine that it took a long time to sit for a portrait because you have to wait for the paint layers to dry. And I imagine the cardinal was a busy man, so maybe he didn't have time to wait for the painting to dry, and so that's why they decided to have a study in Metalpoint, which really helped Jan van Eyck to then transfer it into a color painting. Unfortunately, this sheet is very fragile, and so we were not able to borrow it from Dresden, so unfortunately this won't be in the exhibition, but we'll have many more sheets. This is another of these portrait studies, and this is attributed to Petrus Christie, another Bruges artist in the 15th century. Again, you see he's a falconer, he's set in a room with bookshelves behind him, and you can really see the textures. So he's wearing this woolen hat, and you can see the band and the tall hat, and then here's the falcon with all his feathers expressed in the silver point. Another stunning sheet, and this is one of the sheets in the British Museum, is the head of a young woman wearing a veil. And this is nowadays considered as the only autograph drawing by Rogier van der Weyden. And I think if you look at it, it's just such a stunning sheet. You could just keep looking at it. The veil is almost rendered three-dimensionally. You can almost feel the layers of textiles. There's a small hairpin here at the top, and it's almost glistening like a pearl hairpin. And I think this is really one of the masterpieces of the 15th century. However, it's been described as a portrait drawn from life of a woman, but I think if you look at her face, she's probably a bit too idolized to represent a real woman. So I wonder if it's a portrait study or just an idolized version that Rogier van der Weyden drew and then reused in his paintings afterwards. So now we've discussed the very few original studies that have survived from the 15th century, but the majority of silver point drawings from the 15th century are in fact workshop copies. And these were either done in the workshop by the master himself or by one of his pupils or his apprentices. And these copies can either be done after one of the paintings of the master himself, but also after paintings by other masters which he admired, and some of the elements he found interesting to reuse in his own paintings. For us nowadays, the word copy seems a bit negative, but for the 15th century art history, it's not a negative connotation at all. And in fact, we can learn a lot from the copies that have survived, because they tell us about lost works of art, they can tell us about the evolution of the artist, about workshop practices. So it's not a lesser work of art, so to speak. In fact, this drawing, which represents St. Mary Magdalene, was thought to be another autograph drawing by Rogier van der Weyden because it was linked to one of his paintings. So this is the Braque triptych, which you can visit in the Louvre Museum in Paris. And so here on the right wing of the triptych, you see the same figure, the Mary Magdalene. And so it was long thought that this was incredibly a preparatory study for a painting that had still survived. So it was major to have these two together. However, when they analyzed the painting, they scientifically scanned it, and it turns out there's an underdrawing underneath the paint layers of the painting. And the underdrawing always represents the initial sketch of the artist. And so the underdrawing did not match with the final image, and there were some differences with the veil which extended more backwards. And as you can see, the veil is missing in the drawing. So this means that the drawing is not a reflection of the underdrawing, but it's rather a reflection or a copy or a reproduction of the finished painting. So it's made after the painting was finished. So it's probably not an original study for the painting, but it's definitely closely linked to Rogier van der Weyden's workshop, and it can tell us a lot about how his workshop worked. Another image which I like a lot is a rich man, and here's the rich man who's being tormented in hell by demons. And actually this subject has appeared in a few more Metalpoint drawings, which also shows again that it's a copy, because it's not the one original, but it's copied after a now lost original, and many different artists have copied the same subject. In fact, another reason for knowing why this is a copy is you can see that all these devils, they're clearly pulling at something, and if you look carefully, there's a chain around the rich man's neck, and in fact the chain should have run like this and then like that, but it's simply not drawn into the drawing, so that indicates that it's a copy, because if it's an original study, the artist had to fill out the rope so he could get the right intensity and the right dramatic into his figures. What is also interesting about this sheet, and you will only see this with Dutch and Flemish drawings, so this practice doesn't happen in Italy or in Germany, is that a lot of the elements are actually incised into the ground. So here you see, for instance, that the draftsman has first hatched the metal point very, very thickly, and then he's going to create highlights into the ground by scratching with a knife or with a needle even, because it's really very fine if you look at the original size of the drawing, and then this, in order to create highlights. And so this is a feather, you can see the same in the hair of the man. And so this, I think, really is a testimony of the skill of the draftsman, because you already have to premeditate how you're going to do that. You can only do it once. If you make a mistake, the drawing is ruined. So it's a very clever use of the Metalpoint technique. Most of these copies that I've shown you are dated around 1450, 1460, 1470. So if we now jump 25 years in time, we'll get to Gerard David, who was another Bruges artist. And immediately you see, when you look at his Metalpoint drawings, that he uses it very differently. So this is not meticulously copying other people's works or finished works of art. These are original studies, and you can see how free he sketched these faces of these young women. They're really drawn from life. Here are some studies of hands as well. And in fact, when you look at Gerard David's paintings from the same period, so between 1495 and 1510, you will recognize some of the faces of these girls in his paintings. So you can imagine that he drew some interesting faces and then kept reusing them for other works of art afterwards. And then from the mid-16th century onwards, Metalpoint seems to have died out across Europe. But this situation is very different in the Low Countries, and in fact from the end of the 16th century there are hundreds of Metalpoint drawings surviving. So although the Metalpoint technique is continued to be used in the Low Countries, its function dramatically shifts and changes. So while we've seen that the 15th century and the early 16th century drawings were mainly used in the workshop by artists or their pupils, in the 16th century, the late 16th century and the early 17th century, the shift will be from the painter's workshop into the engraver's workshop. And also artists are going to take it outside of their workshop even. So what will happen from the late 16th century, we'll see that there will be a lot of portrait studies again, but these portrait studies will be made for prints instead of paintings. We'll also see that traveling artists will take sketchbooks with them, so they will take the Metalpoint outside of the studio and use it outdoors. And Metalpoint artists will also use it to record moments of their personal life, so it has nothing to do with their workshop, but it's about their actual intimate home life. So the most prolific of Metalpoint artists from this period, from this later period, is the Dutch engraver Hendrick Galcius. And so by Hendrick Galcius we have around 100 sheets of Metalpoints. And I don't know if you can see it clearly on this slide, but he, instead of just having the cream or the white background, he lightly washes his drawing in a pale yellow, sometimes it's a bit darker yellow. We don't really know the reason for this, but perhaps it was because he was used to working in the copper plates for his engravings. So perhaps he wanted to imitate the color of his copper plates, I don't know. He also uses a different support. It's not very clear, but instead of sheets of paper, his supports are called tafeletten, and so they are very hard, sturdy, inflexible tablets. And they're made of vellum, which are then prepared with a very thick preparation. These again are probably from sketchbooks because they're so sturdy that they were very practical to take around whenever he went outside of his studio. So here you see a stunning portrait, and I've blown it up massively. In fact, in reality, it's only 4 centimeters high. So you have to imagine that Galcius manages to get all this detail to really convey the character of the sitter. Like when you see this, it's like a photograph. You know this man. And what is also apparent is that the clothing, so here you see a faint indication of the ruff here, is not worked out at all, and that is again very typical for printmakers but also for Metalpoint artists. So you can put all this detail in the face, but then for the clothes you don't really need to, because as you can see in the engraving you can use stock models or motifs. For example, here a military costume that you can use from another drawing or another model. Here also the drawing is in reverse to the print, and that's because the printmaker has to engrave his composition in reverse into the copper plate for it to appear in the right direction. Here we see a portrait of the artist himself, and this is his self-portrait, which is dated in 1589, and immediately you see, although the face again is worked out in the highest detail, that this is a very different drawing. This is not a study for an engraving. We also don't know of any prints that are made after this drawing. This is the artist really representing himself as a successful artist, so he's dressed in very rich clothes, very elegant clothes, and in fact he's holding a copper plate and a burin. So this is sort of like a marketing tool to show how successful and how good it is. So this is the verso of the previous drawing, and as I said before, Galcius used these tafeletten, which were originally bound in double-sided sketchbooks. So this shows the randomness of the sketchbook. So first we have the very beautifully worked out self-portrait, and then on the back we have this very rough sketch of a camel, and I don't know if you can see it, but this is the hind leg, here is the head of the camel, his neck, and then his back, and here are his front legs. So you can just imagine Galcius carrying his sketchbook around and opening it at random to make sketches like this. Then Galcius is also the first one not to just use it in the workshop, so not for his prints, instead he takes it out. So here we see botanical studies, animal studies, family portraits. In the top left, in fact, is a study of an exotic tobacco plant, and it was known that Galcius was very interested in botany, and he also had his own garden with exotic plants in it, so you can imagine that he went outside and made a drawing of his very special tobacco plant. Then this is in fact Galcius' own pet dog. So you see that he's not using these Metalpoint drawings for later works to reuse in his own oeuvre, but instead he just draws his pet dog because it gives him pleasure to make a drawing of the dog that he loves so much. And the same for the portrait here, which is a study of probably his sister, Sophia, who's reading. And I always find it a very voyeuristic image because it's like he's drawing her and she's not even noticing that he's standing behind her and making a sketch of her while she's reading. Then, as said before, Metalpoint is also used by artists to train their pupils, and this in fact is a drawing and a print by Jacques de Ghent II, who was one of the most talented pupils of Galcius. And again, we clearly see the influence of his master. He makes very detailed portrait studies with not so detailed clothing to then render them in reverse in an engraving. Another work which also proves that Galcius probably taught his pupils in Metalpoint is this sketchbook, which is preserved in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And as you see, it's very similar to the German example I've shown you before. And here again, you can see the Metalpoint in the shape of a brass pin which holds the clasps together of the sketchbook. In the sketchbook, there are many drawings, and a lot of them, for instance, like this one, are copies after engravings by Galcius. And a lot of them are dated as well, around 1586, 1587, which is almost immediately when Galcius published these prints. So it can be assumed that these were done by an anonymous draftsman who was working in Galcius' studio, in Galcius' workshop, and had direct access to these engravings. Then to show a Flemish example of artists taking Metalpoint sketchbooks outside of the studio. This is a view of Antwerp, of the south part of my hometown, and it shows the St. Michael's Abbey and the St. Andrew Church. And this is done by Hans Bol. And as you can see, it's a double sheet with a fold in the middle. So again, this came from a sketchbook. All the sheets are numbered in the top right corner. And it's interesting when we look at the back of this sheet as well. So on the back of the sheets, which were just pages in the sketchbook, here we see some studies of ships. And in fact, if we compare it with other works by Hans Bol, these ships appear in a view of the harbor of Amsterdam. And then the canal scene on the right here is actually a view from the countryside near Delft. So it's really interesting, I think, but because of these three drawings, you can actually follow the artist while he's traveling. And interestingly, Hans Bol, although he was Flemish, he was Protestant, and we all know when the Spanish Catholic forces took over the south of the Netherlands, all the Protestants had to flee up north to the northern Netherlands. And so in fact what we can see here is a virtual reconstruction of Hans Bol's journey, leaving Antwerp, then going over Delft, and finally reaching Amsterdam. And we know that he did this in 1584, so these drawings can be precisely dated in 1584. So Metalpoint, so now we're 1584, so the very late 16th century. Metalpoint is used less and less in the 17th century. A few Flemish portrait printmakers still use it to make portrait studies, to then make the engravings after, but in generally it's not used that often anymore. Here, however, we see very surprising subjects for Metalpoint. So these two drawings are by Andries Bot, and instead of using it for portrait studies or on his holidays or travels, he uses it to draw peasants. And so Andries Bot was a Dutch genre artist who made a lot of paintings of peasants. So it can be assumed that he went to the tavern, to the inn, and drew a few of the peasants in the countryside. This is very different from the portrait studies that Galcius makes, because they're not as controlled, they're not as meticulous anymore, they're actually drawn quite freely. And I've shown you a detail of the hand of the right peasant. And you see, this is just a spontaneous sketch. The artist is clearly still looking for lines. And so this is a very different, a very loose use of Metalpoint. Also, none of these figures exactly occur in any of his paintings, so maybe he just drew them for his own pleasure. Another artist who also used Metalpoint for his own enjoyment, and perhaps the most famous artist, is Rembrandt again. So here, Rembrandt also uses the tafeletten that Galcius used, so these hard, sturdy boards that were probably bound in a sketchbook. Only 5 drawings are known by Rembrandt to have been made in Metalpoint, but maybe there were a lot more which were in the original sketchbook, which are lost now. 4 of these drawings are made on double-sided sheets, so again, proof that they came from sketchbooks. This one is not double-sided, and this one is probably the most beautiful Metalpoint drawing from the 16th and the 17th century, also because of his subject. So the subject is Rembrandt's fiancée, Saskia van Uylenburg, and in the inscription which Rembrandt wrote himself below the portrait, he says that it's a portrait of his beautiful fiancée, which he took 3 days after they got engaged. And luckily he even dates it for us, and he says the 8th of June in 1633. So this is stunning that we get to see a glimpse of the artist's life, and the artist gets engaged at some point and is so much in love, and then draws his fiancée, and the portrait is just stunning. I think she's sitting somewhere outside, she's wearing her sun hat, she's holding what appears to be a flower, so maybe Rembrandt just gave that to her. And so I think this is really special, that Rembrandt is not using this in his workshop in preparation of maybe his paintings or prints, but instead he's just using it to commemorate very important personal events in his own life. In fact, the other 4 drawings that Rembrandt made in Metalpoint are made around the same time. And for example, here you can see cottages. And some Dutch art historians managed to identify the exact type of cottages that are represented here. And in fact, they are cottages built in Friesland, and we know that Saskia was from Friesland and that they got engaged in Friesland in 1633. So it's very likely that these cottages were drawn on the same trip, maybe even on the same day. On the other side of the same sheet, we see some studies of figures. I don't know if these are really peasants or real people, because they sort of seem to wear exotic costumes, historical costumes, so it might be possible that these were made in Rembrandt's studio when he was posing as models in other costumes. And then this is the last sheet, double-sided sheet by Rembrandt, which again, you see the Frisian cottages appearing, and here's a very typical Dutch flat landscape with a man standing. So luckily in our exhibition we'll have 4 out of the 5 Rembrandt drawings. So we'll have these 2, and these 2, and unfortunately not this one, because it was too fragile to travel from Berlin. So Rembrandt is really the last artist, Dutch and Flemish artist, to work in Metalpoint, and afterwards it dies out across Europe. The reason for that must probably be sought in the distribution of graphite, because now more and more artists start using graphite, which again has a very fine point, can be sharpened all over again. So this will provide artists with a dry technique that doesn't smudge, but at the same time still allows for the greatest precision. And the main advantage of graphite is, of course, it's a lot cheaper and easier to use than the Metalpoint technique, because you don't have to prepare your paper and you don't have to buy the expensive metals. So then Metalpoint hardly is being used during the late 17th century, 18th century, and then all of a sudden there's a revival in the 19th century. And this revival is focused in England from the middle of the 19th century onwards. And this is mainly by artists who were inspired by the Italian Renaissance. So they're using Metalpoint in a way to admire, to emulate the artists that they admired so much. One of the greatest examples, and which we'll also show in the exhibition, is a large study by William Holman Hunt. Then a bit later in the 20th century, we'll have Otto Dix, who will use Metalpoint to draw really big portraits, really big landscapes. Then later on in the 20th century, it's used by very famous contemporary artists, for example, Americans like Jasper Johns, Bruce Nauman. We'll also have sheets of those. And then nowadays, there are hundreds of contemporary artists who still use it nowadays. So many more sheets will be shown in the exhibition, and so I really hope that I will see you again there. Thank you very much.